First of all, to say that I'm very sorry that I won't be there in person or live virtually on the day of the conference. It just happens that I have to be in a part of England where internet connection is absolutely dreadful. That's the way England is. So we thought it's safer to record the talk in advance. And secondly, inevitably, this paper draws on previous work I've done on Guernica, and in particular on the work Anne Wagner and myself were privileged to do with the Reina Sofia for the 80th anniversary exhibition of Guernica. But I've tried to put my thoughts into a new order and bring them up to date. My subject in this paper is the afterlife of a large oil painting done over 80 years ago. I'm confident I don't have to remind you of Guernica's subject and original circumstances, or the place that Picasso's painting occupied in 1937 in the Spanish Republic's pavilion at the Paris World's Fair. Serre's photo of the painting, which is what you're looking at now, seems to me never to grow old. I shall say just one thing about this first moment of Guernica's life. Surely in 1937, I think this comes across quite vividly from the photographs we have of Guernica in the pavilion's inner court, at least if we try to look at them without the wisdom of hindsight. Picasso's painting must have seemed a peculiar exhibit in a context that was desperate to push beyond exhibiting to persuasion. Could we even say, with Hegel's grim verdict on art in the back of our minds, that art for us in its highest vocation is a thing of the past? Could we say that Guernica was already in 1937 an anachronism, an oil painting in the age of cinema and montage? But an anachronism whose very pastness, so it turned out, would prove the key to its going ahead unstoppably into a present and a future. This leads to my lecture's overall question. How is it that Guernica did not settle down comfortably into the half-forgotten canon of modern art? Or worse still, into the status of masterpiece by a questionable dead white male, a known misogynist called Pablo Picasso? How could it be that a 7.5-meter oil painting by that same Picasso, full of self-consciousness about its relation to Roman battle sarcophagi and Goya's 3rd of May and the heavy neoclassical machines of David and his followers in the Louvre, how did it happen that such a painting turned out to be so usable, so indispensable for struggles all through the following 80 years? Struggles often just as desperate and horrific as that of the Spanish Republic with fascism. Let me simply show you at this point a brief sample of those thousands of uses. I'm going to put the images on your screen and present them with very little commentary. First of all, 1969, Vietnam, MoMA, the Art Workers Coalition standing in front of Guernica with their photographs and propaganda concerning the massacre at My Lai. Secondly, this piece of very brave street theater outside a major US base in Carolina in 2003 on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. Thirdly, Madrid, 2003. Fourthly, London, 2005. Iraq invasion well underway. Then, leaping ahead, this extraordinary image from Calcutta in 2007, a demonstration against the repression of ethnic minorities in Nandigram by the central government of West Bengal. Then next, London, 2017, a march for refugee rights. And you'll notice that this is a embroidered tapestry version of Guernica. Next, Palestine, full-scale détournement of Guernica on the exterior of a school in the occupied territories in Palestine around 2015. Next, I find this a particularly touching image, and it's typical of a lot of deeply personal work with Guernica all through these years. One man's Guernica outside the UN building in New York. The date of this uncertain, but presumably at the time of the Iraq invasion. Lastly, or almost lastly, inevitably, I have to show you the tapestry version that the UN itself endowed, commissioned. It was commissioned by Nelson Rockefeller in 1955. And here, of course, no prizes for identifying who is walking past it. She walked past it and the regime walked past it for many years, but of course, notoriously, and here's the next image, the tapestry was covered up with Teflon black tape in 2003 because it was deemed unsuitable for press conferences in 2003 at the time of the run-up to Iraq. And then I returned to the thing itself, a photograph taken by Andrew Moisey, a colleague of mine, in a few years ago in Reina Sofia. How then are we to understand Guernica's continuing life? That's, I've tried to conjure up the continuing life in that sequence of images. The first aspect of my answer I've explored already in various things I've written. It seems to me fundamental, but I'm going to treat it very briefly here. It has to do with Guernica's treatment of space. I believe that the painting goes on speaking to the wider culture so urgently, partly because it shows us the world of the room and the home collapsing. The whole precious distinction between something called the interior, the space of containment, proximity, intimacy, protection, safety, and something called the outside world coming suddenly to an end. It is, if you like, the fact that Guernica contrives a space that is neither outside nor inside, neither room nor street, neither public nor private. This may be what is so incessantly painful and goes on speaking to our condition, whether bombs are falling or not. I don't have to tell you that Picasso was an artist whose whole view of life was predicated on the space of the room and the view from the room into the space of nature outside. Here's still life in front of a window, 1919. It is a dreadful irony that already in 1919, Picasso could casually present us with the force, I mean the technology, that would tear that world apart. Here's still life next to a little watercolor called Plane in the Sky from the same year. Already in the earlier 1930s, before Guernica, in other words, you can see Picasso increasingly aware that the exterior was invading the room and doing terrible things to its inhabitants. Here's Plane in the Sky next to this extraordinary drawing called Hirondelle, ink drawing called Hirondelle from 1934. Guernica, I believe, is the end of this train of thought. Here's Guernica next to Hirondelle. I think that already I'm talking about one deep source of Guernica's continuing hold on our psyche. The kind of space it dares to present to us speaks, so it seems, to our culture's deepest fears, but also to our deepest intuitions about the nature of the ordinary world we inhabit, in peace as well as war. We know that many of those who've thought hardest about the 20th and 21st century condition have arrived at the same conclusion as Picasso, that our culture's experience is marked more and more by a fundamental homelessness and disorientation, a felt loss of world, and by a desperate or horrible nostalgia for that world we have lost, for an order of some sort, for a set of walls and confinements and hierarchies that we dream of building or enforcing again. Hence, by the way, the eternal appeal of fascism. We are, as I say, at the heart of Guernica's power here. But I want now, in the rest of this talk, to turn to another facet of that power, the painting's presentation of human beings and their emotions and understanding in the face of horror. Here's Guernica again. In particular, I want to press at the notion of Guernica as showing us modern life as tragedy. Guernica, my procession of uses and reuses of the picture suggests as much, I hope, seems to be accepted around the world as, for some reason, our new tragic scene. I don't want the question of space to go away in what follows. At the center of tragedy, as Picasso presents it, is a fundamental loss of boundaries, of inhabitable shared space. But it's how Picasso's human beings live that loss that will mainly concern me. Let me focus first on the very notion of tragedy. And let me try to get into focus straight away the difference between sheer horror, sheer downfall, and the rather different thing we call tragedy. Something is done to horror and downfall in tragedy that raises them, so audiences have felt through history, to a higher power. Inevitably, we turn back to Aristotle here, whose first great thoughts on tragedy go on resonating. Tragedy, he says in a famous passage, is an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of a certain grandeur. In language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, producing pity and terror in the audience, and thereby cleansing the audience of these emotions. His famous word here is catharsis. Why the experience of pity and terror in the theater is cathartic, Aristotle never really explains. He seems to take it as self-evident. Some have doubted Aristotle's confidence, and others, like Brecht, have disapproved of the cleansing. Is pity an emotion we want to be purged of, asked Brecht? Are we right to call it an emotion in the first place? But let me put these questions aside. They take us, I think, towards insoluble mysteries, and stay simply with the question of horror. Aristotle knows full well that agony and atrocity are intrinsic to tragedy's appeal, but he makes a distinction between the appearance of the dreadful on stage and its unfolding in an action, its progress towards a moment of recognition. Tragedy, he admits, is partly a matter of sheer unbearable presentation, made more insistent by a range of theatrical effects, the circular stage, the dancing and wailing chorus, the backdrop of the scene. He calls all this terrible proximity spectacle, and he is conscious of spectacle's power. I quote him again. Pity and terror may be aroused by means of spectacle, but they may also result from the inner structure of the piece, which is the better way. For the plot ought to be so constructed that even without the aid of the eye, he who hears the tale will thrill with horror and melt to pity at what is taking place. To produce this effect by mere spectacle is a less artistic method. Those who employ the means of spectacle end up creating a sense not of the terrible, but only the monstrous, and are strangers to tragedy's true purpose. Well, I think we should try to look at Guernica with those distinctions in mind. And the following questions occur, obviously. What constitutes the true tragic scene as opposed to the spectacle of horror? What is an action as opposed to an appearance? Is there a difference between the terrible and the monstrous? And here's another helpful critical voice. It belongs to a great 19th century writer on Shakespearean tragedy called A.C. Bradley. He was the brother of a remarkable Hegelian philosopher, and his general thoughts on tragedy seem to me some of the most searching we have. The center of the tragic impression, says Bradley, is the impression of waste. The pity and fear which are stirred by the tragic story on stage seems to unite with and even merge in a profound sense of sadness and mystery. We seem to have before us a type of the mystery of the whole world. Everywhere in that world, from the crushed rocks beneath our feet to the souls of man, we see power, intelligence, life, and glory, which astound us and seem to call for our worship. And everywhere we see them perishing, devouring one another and destroying themselves, often with dreadful pain, as though they came into being for no other end. Tragedy is the typical form of this mystery. It forces the mystery upon us. Here are the quotes again. A profound sense of sadness and mystery. Everywhere we see them perishing. A type of the mystery of the whole world. Enormous claims. But it does seem, as I've been arguing, that Guernica has been felt by generation after generation and in enormously different places and circumstances to live up to them. Why? How on earth did Picasso, of all people, come to raise his art to this higher power? When the delegates of the Spanish Republic came to him in early 1937 to ask him to do a mural for their pavilion, it seems that Picasso told them he wasn't certain that he could produce a picture of the kind they wanted. And he was surely right to have doubts. Was there anything in his previous art on which he could draw in order to speak publicly, grandly, to a scene of civil war? Wouldn't he be straying into a territory, the public, the political, the large scale, the heroic and compassionate, that very little in his previous work seemed to have prepared him for? In the 10 years preceding Guernica, Picasso had been, to put it boldly, the artist of monstrosity. I show you now one of his most extraordinary and greatest works, I think, the painter and model from 1927, which is in the collection in Tehran. His paintings had set forth a view of the human as constantly haunted and maybe defined by a monstrous, captivating otherness, most markedly perhaps in the Punch and Judy show of sex. In his art, monstrosity was capable, certainly, of attaining to beauty, or monumentality, or even to a kind of strange pathos. But do any of these inflections lead to Guernica? Going back to Aristotle, aren't the monstrous and the tragic two very separate things? To paint Guernica, in other words, wasn't Picasso obliged to change key as an artist and sing a tune that he'd never before tried? And more than that, positively to suppress in himself the fascination with horror that had shaped so much of his previous work. Horror and sexuality were inseparable in Picasso and would continue to be so after 1937. I show you for a moment or two, it's hard to look at, the death of Marat from 1934. But isn't Guernica great precisely to the extent that it manages for once in Picasso to show us women and animals in pain and fear without eliciting that stunned, half repelled, half attracted fascination? The answer, I think, is yes and no. Yes, I would claim, Guernica does escape from the entanglement of horror and desire that had been so pervasive in Picasso's art in the previous 10 years. We have, as it happens, a record of the escape. In the precious photographs of Guernica in the making, taken by Dora Maar at the time, I show you one of the very earliest. I think this is State 2. One can actually see the appeal of women's bodies in extremis being painted out day by day, week by week, and agonized beauty giving way slowly to immediate imperative signs for terror. This is a story I tried to tell in my book, Picasso and Truth. But yes and no. No, there is not, in my view, a hard and fast dividing line between Guernica and Picasso's previous work. Picasso had always been the artist of the unknown, of haunting, of utter vulnerability. Here's the 1927 painter and model again. It was this sensibility he could draw on in 1937. As for me, he said to Marot around the time Guernica was being painted, as for me, I think that everything is unknown. Everything's the enemy. Everything, not just some things, everything. Civil war, the appearance of humanity's terrible vengefulness and love of taking sides, was a state Picasso empathized with only too well. No doubt he would have loathed and despised the fascist General Mola's pronouncement of the 19th of July, 1936. I quote it: "We must spread terror. It is imperative to show that we are the ones in control by eliminating unscrupulously and without hesitation all those who do not think as we do. There can be no cowardice. If we hesitate for a moment and fail to proceed with utter determination, we shall not win." And when they did. Picasso would have loathed this, but he would have understood it. Terror and the wish to dominate were basic to his worldview. Everything human beings build for themselves, all rooms, all communities, all civilizations are, he knew, fragile shells. Enemies are lying in wait. One piece of testimony to Picasso's feelings about just such matters is worth referring to. It is a story told by his friend Daniel Henri Canfile. Sometime in November 1933, the year is important, and we know that events in 1933 were monitored closely in Picasso's circle. So I think the advent of Hitler to power is in his mind. Sometime in November 1933, the artist came back from a meeting, or was it actually a psychoanalytic session, with the analyst Jacques Lacan. They'd fallen out about a recent murder case. Earlier in the same year, two maidservants from Le Mans, the Papin sisters, had slaughtered their mistress and her daughter. They gouged out their victim's eyes while the two women were still alive, and then gone to bed, lying naked and bloody to await the arrival of the police. Kahnweiler reports Picasso's reaction as follows. Picasso has seen Dr. Lacan, with whom he is not at all in agreement. He claims that the Papin sisters are mad, he said. And Picasso went on to declare that he admired the Papin sisters, who had dared to do what each of us would like to do, and nobody dares to. If you put the Papin sisters safely in the subhuman category mad, what becomes of tragedy then, he told me? Et les grands sentiments, la haine, hatred. I reminded him that the judges had not considered the sisters to be mad. Picasso, yes, the judges, they have a classical education. Today's psychiatrists are the enemies of tragedy and of saintliness too. And saying that the Papin sisters are mad means getting rid of that admirable thing called sin. End of quote. These are hard sayings, the kind of things Picasso's hostile biographers feast on. My task is to think of them as an aspect of the mind that went to make Guernica. Monstrosity of the Papin sort. This is what the artist seems to be asserting. And again, I suggest that the wider tragedy of fascism in Europe is in the background. Monstrosity is what the human reveals itself to be in moments of maximum intensity. Some of what he was saying to Kahnweiler was no doubt play acting and provocation. Picasso knew that Kahnweiler was easily shocked, but the core ideas seemed to me deeply felt. Putting the dreadfulness of the Papin sisters' violence into a separate, straightforwardly mad category means, so Picasso thinks, that we close ourselves against everything in the two women's conduct that we know to be ordinary, indelible, dangerous in ourselves, and fundamental for the making of the ego. The word he blurts out is hatred. Hatred is intrinsic to the human, he believes, by which he means, I think, destructiveness, deep resentment of the other and its power, a tearing and a rending that lie at the heart of the constitution of the self. And other things too, guilt, sin, and of course, in answer, its desperate, never to be finished disavowal of sin. And therefore, because guilt remains, the eternal appeal of the taboo, the wicked, the transgressive, the terrible. I'm not saying, I hasten to add, that I assent to Picasso's view of human nature, but he is attempting an answer to the reality of human conduct as he saw it unfolding in the 1930s. And so is his art. You cannot have Guernica, here's a great large detail from it, without a deep awareness of human beings' monstrosity. You cannot have Guernica without a deep contempt, more's the pity, for the hopes and platitudes of liberal humanism. Picasso was angry with the psychiatrists, yes, but surely he was even more dismissive of the lingua franca of liberalism. Faced with fascism, he believed, it had nothing to say. At least the psychiatrist knew that the human being was a conflicted, tragic, fabulous, appalling beast. I'll start again, but this time from Guernica's actual circumstances, the reality of the scene it shows us. Guernica is a tragic scene, a downfall, a plunge into darkness. But of course, it's a distinctively 20th century one, alas. Its subject is death from the air. Here is one of the few photographs of Guernica, the village itself, the town itself, in 1937. That death could fall from heaven on so many, Picasso told an interviewer a few years later. Right in the middle of rushed life, that has always had a great meaning for me. A great meaning and a special kind of horror. The historian Marc Bloch had this to say on the same subject in 1940. No, the fact is that this dropping of bombs from the sky has a unique power of spreading horror. Of spreading terror. A man is always afraid of dying, but particularly so when to death is added the threat of complete physical disintegration. No doubt this is a peculiarly illogical manifestation of the instinct of self-preservation, but its roots lie very deep in human nature. Bombing of the kind experimented with in April 1937, carpet bombing, strategic bombing, total war, is terrifying for many different reasons, because the people on the ground cowering in their shelters may imagine themselves suddenly gone from the world, ripped apart and scattered, vanished without trace. Because what will put an end to them so completely comes out of the blue and has no imaginable form. They'll never know what hit them. Because death from now on is potentially all engulfing, no longer a matter of individual extinctions recorded on a war memorial, but of whole cities, whole worlds, whole forms of life snuffed out in an hour or so. Think of human beings in the midst of this, trying to see what was killing them. A detail of Guernica again. Guernica, I go back to the question of tragedy, is above all a picture of women and animals looking for death, trying to face annihilation, to see where it's coming from and what form it will take, so as to attain to Aristotle's moment of recognition. And their tragedy is that they cannot find it. The woman with the lamp, of course, is the emblem of that looking and not finding. But her directedness is seconded by the woman stumbling and peering below and the desperate backward stare of the horse. They look, but they cannot see. The shape of the world has vanished. We could say that the nowhereness and isolation of the women in Guernica are what terror with a whole new technology at its disposal, most wants to produce. It wants to destroy collectivity and make the enemy a mass, a mosaic of lost individuals scared for their lives. But surely Guernica would not have played the role it has for the past 80 years if all it showed was absolute negativity. It is a scene, not a meaningless shambles. It presents us at the degree zero of experience with an image of horror shared. Death as a condition that opens, in spite of everything, a last space for the human. This is hard to think about, and Hannah Arendt is helpful, I think. She'll be my guide from now on. In her book on violence, Arendt discusses a claim made by Frantz Fanon that armed struggle against an oppressor is to be welcomed because it is the greatest of all social equalizers, the final destroyer of shame and subservience, and therefore, says Fanon, the royal road to freedom and solidarity. Arendt is very unhappy with this proposal, but she recognizes its force. Here's what she says. Of all equalizers, death does seem to be the most potent, at least in the few extraordinary situations where it is permitted to play a political role. Death, whether faced in actual dying or in the inner awareness of one's own mortality, is perhaps the most anti-political experience there is. It signifies that we shall disappear from the world of appearances and leave the company of our fellow men. As far as human experience is concerned, death indicates an extreme of loneliness and impotence. But faced collectively and in action, death changes its countenance. Now nothing seems more likely to intensify our vitality than the proximity of death, something we are usually hardly aware of, namely that our own death is accompanied by the potential immortality of the group we belong to, and in the final analysis of the species, moves then into the center of our experience. It is as though life itself, the immortal life of the species, nourished, as it were, by the sempiternal dying of its individual members, is surging upwards at such a moment, actualized in the practice of violence. Arendt is understandably reluctant to accept Fanon's conception of politics, which she's just summarized here, but she understands its force. The group faces death together, and in some sense, facing it together, even when they cannot see it, means that they glimpse their continuing life. Here's Guernica, the whole picture again. Well, I know it is difficult, maybe impossible, to describe what is happening here without one's language tipping into the falsely redemptive. Nothing that takes place in Guernica, to make my own feelings clear, strikes me as redeemed or even transfigured by the picture's black and white reassembly of its parts. Fear, pain, sudden death, disorientation, screaming immediacy, disbelief, the suffering of animals, none of these realities falls into place. Judith Butler, the philosopher, in an essay written a few years ago, on the lookout for a basis on which a future politics might be built, asked her readers, interestingly, to consider the idea of a collectivity founded on weakness, vulnerability, affiliation, and collective resistance. These, she argued, could be such a collectivity's building blocks. I believe that Guernica's usefulness, its continuing life in so many different contexts, may derive from the fact that it pictures politics in a similar way. We should remind ourselves that, again, in its early stages, I show you Mars' photograph of state 2 of the painting underway. Guernica saw armed struggle rather differently. At the beginning, It did so even with a little of Frantz Fanon's heroics. The bombing was centered on a beautiful, naked male, fist clenched, reaching skyward, asserting the immortality of the group. But then the fist evaporated and the hero became a broken statue. Here is State 4, Mars photograph. Women, not men, lived the moment of death. The image of politics Guernica ended by proposing was one in which affiliation and collective resistance are there in human vulnerability, if the latter can be shown, understood as a shared tragic fate. Not the upright fist, the upraised fist, simply the being together of creatures facing annihilation. There's one last thing to be said, I think, though perhaps it hardly needs saying. Guernica lives on because the state of war and so-called peace to which it gives form lives on. Not never again, alas, but again and again and again. War from the air, states using their technical power to crush all attempts to resist their versions of allowable life, remains our surrounding reality. And I finish by showing you a succession of painful images of the world we still live in. Here we are in Yemen with planes and bombs supplied by Trump, or in Afghanistan, even as we speak, where the tonnage of high explosive expended over the 20-year defeat by the Taliban will never be calculated. Or in the anarchist Republic of Rojava, the Kurdish non-state bombed into nothingness 2 years ago by Turkey, with planes and bombs supplied by all the powers of the earth. Trump, Putin, NATO, you name them. Once again, in the Kurdish struggle, Guernica was invoked directly. I came across a 2019 account of the bombing, accompanied, I show you the image here, by a poet's letter to Picasso, asking the painter's ghost to compare the horrors of 1937 to the present. And as in anarchist Catalonia, women in anarchist Rojava, here are some of Rojava's propaganda photos, women were the central actors of war, the fighters, the sufferers, the tragedians. You can imagine the satisfaction of Trump and Erdogan and Putin and Islamic State at the bombings putting an end to this realm of possibility for women, these faces, this strength, these freedoms. Fascism, I need hardly remind you, is in its many forms on the move again. Catalonia is once more in crisis. Here are Catalonians on the march. On the streets of Madrid, here's a press photo. Older white men make the Franco salute. The unity of Spain is sacred. If I were running the museum a few streets away in Madrid, in which Picasso's Guernica is housed, here it is in situ, I would play safe and put extra guards in front of the painting with guns to protect it. Thank you.